Well, I do see a lot of names on here that I recognize. And so I'm not sure how many pointers I have that you guys aren't already aware of, but maybe hopefully some of the tips that I have will help some of you. Um, so I did want to talk, go through some of my like things that I've learned over the years about um, getting more confirmations. So I think I wrote in the reminder email today that it's like a really good time of year right now to get out and go atlasing. There are a lot of birds they're really busy, either building nests or caring for their young already. And so it's a pretty good time of year to start getting out there and confirming breeding for a lot of species. Um, and so, one of the questions I get asked, and I think sometimes people debate this a little bit, but it's this question of like, how is atlasing different than your normal bird watching, right? And some people think that there is no difference. Um, I tend to think that there is a bit of a difference because instead of going out and like maximizing how many species you're seeing, what you're doing is really trying to pay attention to all of the behaviors and like what the birds are doing. And in order to do that, you really have to like look at the birds. So instead of just like walking down a trail and hearing the birds and being like, oh, there's a peewee, there's a tanager, there's a grosbeak, you actually have to try to find those birds and see what they're up to. And because you're doing that, it's just much slower, it's more intentional. You have to like, try to actually see a lot of the birds that and see what they're doing. And then watch them for a little bit. You can't just like say, yep, there it is, and keep on going. You actually have to sit with it for a little bit and really follow it to see what it's doing. Um, and that I've found over the years that it's, not only important to slow down, but to be as quiet as possible. And even on top of that, I found like camouflaging yourself as much as possible can really help as well. So like if you see a bird somewhere, if you can stand in front of a tree so that the bird doesn't see your human silhouette, and instead you can break it up by standing in front of behind a bush or in front of a tree or something, just so that you're a little bit more hidden. It really does make a difference. Like I used to be skeptical, but I think it really does make a difference. And the birds will much more quickly get used to your presence and go back to doing whatever they would normally be doing if you weren't there. So that's one thing that I do. I also I always look at the bills first. I mean, as soon as you ID the bird first, right? ID the bird and then look at the bill, right? That's like the first thing that you should be doing in order to see if it's carrying something. And that's going to tell you a lot. And, there's carrying nesting, there's carrying food, there's carrying a fecal sac. And it's like one of the easiest ways to actually confirm breeding for species, because each of those stages lasts for a couple weeks, right? They're feeding their young for several weeks. They're building their nest for a week at a time. And so it's not just like a one-time thing where you're like, you might see them copulate, or you'll see them, maybe you'll stumble across a nest, but these behaviors are repeated. And so you have a lot higher chance of actually seeing them. So look at the bills. That's like the first thing. And then I think a lot of people, we're so used to identifying birds by sound. And I think we hear a song and then we're like, okay, that's what it is. And we just kind of keep moving on. But with atlasing, a lot of times it's the unmated males that are going to be singing later into the season. And if you stand there and you watch that unmated male for 15, 20 minutes, you're not going to see anything that's going to indicate that it's actually breeding, anything more than just singing. So what you really want to do is look for the really quiet birds, the secretive birds, the ones that are making call notes instead of songs. A lot of times the pairs will make these little contact notes to talk to each other and communicate with each other. In some species, like red-eyed vireo, the females will actually make noise while they're on the nest. So sometimes it can actually cue you in to the actual nest site. And then, well, starting now, actually, I just ran into it was like yesterday, one spot on this trail where you could hear 3 different downy nests with all the young going blah, 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 like there were just like downies everywhere. And so really listening for the begging sounds, if you can hear them, there's certainly, we were talking before we got started about some of us have some hearing loss, right, as we get older, and a lot of those begging sounds we tend to lose really quickly. But some of the begging sounds, if you do hear them, can cue you in to a nest or to the fledglings. And so if you keep looking in that direction, eventually you'll see an adult come into that area and it'll be bringing food for them. So that's a really helpful thing. Definitely, I spend way more time watching females than I do males. So in species that are sexually dimorphic, where you can tell the difference between males and females, I spend a lot more time on the males. I'm sorry, on the females, because that's they're the birds that tend to be, not always, but for the most part, are doing a lot of the caretaking. They're the ones that are incubating, they're building the nest, they're the ones that are feeding the young, and whatnot, and they often stay with the young until they fledge. So definitely spending a lot of time with those females. Another thing that maybe some people who are spreading out a little bit and hitting multiple blocks, if you say like I did the other day, I started hearing all of these downy woodpeckers calling in one area, and then a lot of times they'll be locally synchronized that within that species. So the other downy woodpeckers in the area will also be at the same stage in their nesting cycle. So if you hear the downies in their cavities begging, or like this morning, it was just like all the common yellowthroats had food in their bills, right? And so if I go to another block tomorrow nearby, I can pretty much expect that the yellowthroats are also going to be feeding young, if you're within a fairly small area. So they do tend to be synchronized across areas. So if you are working on multiple blocks, to pay attention to that. It can be really interesting to see how things are synchronized across a small area. Another thing is to be prepared. So I think, and this is something that, depending on how skilled you are, how long you've been birding, it may be harder for you to do if you're more of a beginner, but knowing kind of those habitat associations, knowing where, what species you're likely to see in an area, and just keeping an ear out for those species. That can be really helpful. So when you're in, a forest, you're really paying attention, like, am I hearing a peewee? Am I hearing a tanager. But if I'm in a field, then I'm going to be really keying in for, a song sparrow or a yellow throat or something. So having some inkling of the timing and the ranges and the habitat preferences within the range can be really helpful to kind of get you like one step further. But if you are more on the beginner side of things, I suggest, starting out easy, starting out with what you do know already. So if you know a lot of the birds that breed in the local park, just really trying to get to know those birds really well can be really helpful, because a lot of the behaviors that birds exhibit throughout the breeding season, it's the same for all the other birds in that group. So, if you're watching a red-eyed vireo, what you learn watching that red-eyed vireo is going to be really helpful for watching a warbling vireo, for example. And so you just start out really easy. You start with what you know, and then you just slowly build on that. And so, part of getting better is asking a lot of questions, and being resourceful and looking up anything that you don't know. So I do have on the Atlas website a list of resources, of links, of all kinds of websites and apps, mobile apps that I do recommend. So last month we talked a lot about the Merlin app, which is super useful, particularly for if you have any doubts about sounds that you're hearing. It's really, really helpful. But then if you want to know a little bit more about the breeding cycle and maybe some of the behaviors and exactly where a bird is building their nest, then I would recommend using the Audubon app. So Audubon has a free app that provides a lot more of that type of information. So there's a whole list of resources, and in a few minutes I can put that link in the chat as well. But yeah, I think asking questions is a really great way, and it doesn't necessarily need to be even asking a question to somebody else. It can just be asking yourself, well, why is that bird here and not over there? Or why is that bird doing that? What does that behavior mean? Asking those kinds of questions is what's really going to help you grow as a birder and as an atlaser in particular. And that will eventually lead you to getting more confirmations and seeing more breeding behaviors. And then I would say, a lot of atlasing is really just putting the time in and just being out there and being alert and paying attention. That can be just in and of itself. Sometimes I'll just go out to some place I've never been before, and I'll just sit down on a log in the middle of the forest, and I'll just sit there for 20 minutes and just see what comes along, just so I can get a feel for what's going on and see who's around, and see what they're doing. So sometimes it can just be really a matter of putting the time in and being patient and waiting. Yeah, I think that's most of my big tips for getting more confirmations. I think there's a lot of really subtle cues that you will pick up on over time that I think are really hard to put into words sometimes. It's like you look at this catbird and you'll be like, no, that one's just, I don't know, feeding for itself or something. It's not really acting very nesty. When you might look at another catbird and you're just like, wow, that bird is really focused and it's really trying to get like as much food as it can into its bill so that it can go and feed its young. And over time, you'll be able to like sense that pretty quickly just by looking at a bird. So really just spending time out there, you'll slowly just kind of absorb these small little micro cues that you may not even be aware of. And I think that's one of the like really fun things to reflect on as an atlaser and think about like everything that you learn, within a season. It's quite remarkable, I think. Um, I don't know if other people have other suggestions that they want to share. I mean, Dan, I know Dan Nickerson, you've been atlasing a long time. Do you have other tips that you would add to that?
No, but I have a question.
Okay, yeah, perfect.
Something that I haven't studied very much are birds with multiple broods. And I'm going to be, since I'm coming from Maine and staying with family in the Adirondacks, I'm going to be a little later this year, than what would be peak maybe.
Mhm.
But I know some of the birds that like bluebirds and I think eastern phoebes sometime. But I wonder if there's any others that we should be looking for. I know I found a fuzzy red-eyed vireo being fledged in the middle late August one year. Now it could just be an anomaly, but I don't know. Are there other birds that we should be looking for second or third birds or broods or whatever later into the season?
Yes. So there's actually a lot of birds that will have multiple broods. And then also you have not just the multiple broods, but you have birds that, may fail for one reason or another, and then they'll just
Right.
get started later. So you also have those as well. But in terms of birds that have multiple broods, like grosbeaks and cardinals also have multiple broods. Um, I'm going to put in the chat a link. So I just put a link to the resources that I mentioned a little bit ago. And now let me put in here another link to, let's see here, the on the website, there's the handbook and materials page. And if you scroll down there is in the, what is it? The breeding behavior references section. There is a breeding season table from the last atlas. And that table tells you whether or not species have, or how many broods they have. So it'll say like one brood, two broods, 2 to 3 broods. So there's it goes through all the species that breed in the state and tells you which ones have multiple broods. So that'd be a good way to know. And then Stacy mentioned to keep in mind the late nesters, so waxwings and goldfinches are late, sedge wrens can be late, dick sissels can be late. So there are a few species that haven't even started yet. But yeah, I always find rose-breasted grosbeaks and cardinals to be really fascinating because they'll have like 2 or 3 broods per year. And when the first batch fledges, the male takes those young and feeds them and gets them to where they're like independent, while the female starts nesting again. And so the pair kind of splits up a little bit their duties, and they have overlapping broods, which I find is pretty cool. So yeah, that if you notice that you're seeing like lots of male cardinals or male grosbeaks feeding young, it's because the female is probably on the next batch of eggs.
I was a naturalist at Heart Lake one time there for 80K, and that there was a couple people that were studying and banding dark-eyed juncos,
Mm,
and so yeah, I learned that overlapping kind of thing, and I think with Phoebe's too.
mhm.
Yeah, that was definitely going on. It was so interesting because they sort of wanted to engage me and keeping an eye on things. I'd
Yeah,
never paid that much attention to that before, but it was going on. A lot more going on than I thought. So that was,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, it's really amazing. And, and there's still so much that we don't know about breeding biology. It's really amazing. Like once you start diving deeper, there's just still a lot of things we don't know. So yeah. And there's just some really amazing, remarkable things that do go on and we just aren't tuned into it. Yeah. Um, great.
Speaking of tuning in, we had talked about hearing loss
Mhm.
earlier. Um, so a lot of times I'll just have Merlin on, and there'll be a slew of birds that I can't hear. Um, Now, can I use that as a singing bird, or is that totally, is Merlin considered 100% accurate?
It's not considered 100% accurate. You should really treat Merlin as if it's like a bird guide. It's really a resource for you in order to confirm what you're hearing or seeing. Um, so what I've done with some of the birds that I can't hear, but that Merlin is picking up is, I mean, I used to be able to hear some of these birds like 20 years ago. And I mean, I know that I'm young to have hearing loss, but I do have significant hearing loss. And so, like this year I've realized I'm missing a lot of warblers. It's really kind of sad. And but I used to know them. And so I still kind of I know the habitat preferences and I know, where they are, like if they're in the canopy or the understory or, if they're going for fruit or if they're going for spiders on the trunk. And so I use all of that information that I have to try to find the bird and then I can see it and then I feel comfortable adding it to my checklist. Or if you're with someone else who is younger and can hear it and independently confirm it, then that's fine too.
I think another way is when Merlin is going, you can actually see the spectrogram on Merlin. So if you're actually good at knowing the spectrogram of various species, like the black-pole warbler, for instance, if you're up high, then you could probably use that if you know the spectrogram of a bird and see it on Merlin.
Mhm.
Yeah, I
I
haven't
did
thought
know
about
that.
that, but
Yeah, no, seeing the sonogram, I can see that, but I'm just wondering if Merlin picks up other sounds, like it picked up an osprey today. So I looked up, and it had to be close enough for me to see, and I can hear an osprey, but it misidentified, I think, some sound and as an osprey.
yeah, so it's still not 100%. And I don't actually know, the new version that just came out was just released like was that a month ago? It was probably even longer ago. It just time flies. But it's much improved from the previous version. But I don't know what the accuracy is. Like I mean, I'm sure it has to meet some level of accuracy before the app would actually show you a potential identification. But I don't actually know what that threshold is.
Maybe somebody can correct me, but I've heard it's only about 80%, based, yes, of course it gets every cardinal, but it may take a chip note from a cardinal and call it something else if it's a little off. I think maybe somebody from around here we've had a lot of Philadelphia Vireos, and I was talking to somebody that's a musician, and they said that there's a piece of the red eye that sounds exactly like Philadelphia. So, so yeah, I would definitely, I can't say 80% that's what this gentleman said. But I have that, I was getting barred owls in a field somewhere. I think that might be a car noise, or a road, I shouldn't say, on the road near a field. So there's definitely a certain ones, and I don't know who may even have a list of that, but that would be great to have.
Yeah, I've tried to get actually Drew Weber. He's the developer at Cornell that has programmed and put the app together. I've tried to have him come and talk, but he's pretty busy, so I haven't been able to work that out yet. But hopefully I will one of these days. But I do know that for some species, like you're saying, like cardinal, it's really high accuracy. Philadelphia Vireo is one of the ones that actually is like completely, I would not rely on that. It's, yeah, that's one of the ones where I just feel like you need to have a visual ID on that species. But osprey, yeah, that's funny that it would miss ID an osprey. I would think it would have figured that out, but
No, I've had it miss ID Osprey a couple times. I use it a lot.
mhm.
And it's helping me learn song because I'm just not good at it. But it definitely I'm in habitat that would be almost impossible. So
Charlie.
Our group that was up in the Adirondacks this week clearly identified at least a half a dozen times that Merlin was giving us very incorrect information. Philadelphia Vireo was one that just kept coming up. There must have been 20 of them in the Adirondacks. It's like they were everywhere, it seemed, according to Merlin. But a number of other ones too. I can't remember specifics, but I remember in our conversations in the evening talking about results for Merlin, because everybody does use it for sure, a good effect. But they also know when it's wrong. And pretty much everybody in the group had a story about Merlin was wrong on this one or Merlin was wrong in that one. So I definitely would use it with a few grains of salt.
Yeah, and I'm seeing in the chat, there's a few people giving some other examples too of Andrea said she had a Hutton's Vireo in Allegheny County, which is that's a good one. And Allie said she had a chestnut sided, she had a magnolia. I'm sorry, I'm reading it backwards again. She had a chestnut sided that Merlin said it was magnolia. And I will say this week I've had a bunch of yellow warblers that I swear I could have sworn were chestnut sided, and I would use Merlin and it would be like yellow warbler, chestnut sided warbler, magnolia warbler, American redstart. It was like going through all of them that were similar, and it just was like, I can't decide. I was like, I can't decide either. So I guess I need to see that bird. Yeah.
I've been using hearing aids for about 10 years, and after the last program, I started using Merlin. I think it's right that you shouldn't use it to identify birds, but it's helpful in locating them. And the other thing to know, as you become deaf or use hearing aids, you have to relearn the birds, because your hearing aid only picks up certain frequencies out of the call. So I had to re-educate myself, kind of. My memories of what the birds sounded like are no longer there. And I do think it's very useful because it will pick up birds that are, even with my hearing aids, are outside of what I can hear. But if you walk sometimes not very far, like even 50 feet or 100 feet, I can pick them up with my hearing aid. So it'll tell me that there's a bird singing close to me, but it's just out of my range. But if I walk just a little bit further, I can find that bird. So particularly if it's something that you need to have for your block or something like that, it's worth spending that time sort of chasing around until you locate it. but definitely, I do think it, for identifying birds, that I don't think that's what it should be used for, but it's helpful in that way. And I'm getting, just for a week now, so I had my 10-year-old hearing aids, and now I have a new set, and oh my gosh, the improvement in it is unbelievable. And I can regulate the whole thing from my phone.
Yeah.
And so I'm actually talking with a friend of mine who has a bird store, and I think I've been doing a little reading about it. I think if anybody would like to talk with me about it, I think there's really more potential in learning how to use this for a lot of us that would be useful. So I'll
Mhm.
put my email in the chat, and if anybody wants to, think with me about this, there's a lot of us in this category.
Yeah, there
And
are,
more and more.
unfortunately. Yeah. But not that little one.
Yeah.
She probably has perfect hearing. I don't want to be remiss. Ben asked a question a little bit ago in the chat. And Ben asked, which groups of species should we exclude from using the breeding code CF carrying food? Is it more than just raptors and gulls? So actually we've changed that from previous Alice's, where we're asking people to report what they see, when they see it, where they see it. So if you see something carrying food, you can enter it that way. However, I will say that as you've indicated, that for raptors and gulls and terns, there are any others, kingfisher, there's probably a few others I'm forgetting. If you can provide a little bit of extra information in the species comments and say, corvids is another one. So if you say, I saw a crow flying in and out of this tree into the same place of the tree over and over again, then that's like a pretty good indication that it's actually breeding there. And without that information, it's not quite as, I don't have as much confidence in that report in terms of interpreting it as local breeding, if that makes sense. So report what you see, but if you can add some comments for some of those tricky species, then that will be extremely helpful. Let me see, there's some more comments down here. Right, and yeah, and Stacy mentioned something else. I think Jerry mentioned this before we got started too, that Merlin does help us, those of us who have certain species that we tend to tune out. I think Jerry mentioned mourning dove, and it can be other species, like sometimes red-bellied woodpecker or crows or something that you tend to tune out, and Merlin will remind you, oh yeah, I did hear that was here. That's another really good use for Merlin. Let me say one more thing, Charlie, and the other thing is that Merlin, I think, is also really good because you have a recording and you can save that recording and you can upload it to your checklist. And so that is also really good. It gives you a little bit of extra documentation in case there's any question later on down the road. So Charlie, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, to go back to the question about corvids carrying food and so on. So for example, with a blue jay, I know blue jays cache food. Do they cache insects? Like, for example, if I see a blue jay carrying a worm, is that going to be probably feeding young? Whereas if it's carrying a seed, it might be going to cache that. Is that a legitimate conclusion to draw?
Yeah, I would think so. Yeah. The problem with some of the other species is that, they, like raptors have certain perches that they repeatedly go to where they will eat the food themselves. So, you know, they have like a hacking site, right? Where they go and they like, that's where that bird always goes and eats the food. And so you might see the bird on its way to that location and not realize. And so that's why it can be a little like, I don't know, you know, and like, you know, terns can be carrying food for themselves. They can be carrying it for their mate. They can be carrying it for their young. You know, so in the past atlases, we had people just not report that behavior at all. But we have changed it for this atlas. Primarily, you know, for one reason is it makes it easier for people who are beginner atlasers to participate and get into atlasing, because they may not have all of that natural history information as when they start out. And so it's a really great way to get people into the atlas. But we also want to make sure that we're capturing the entire breeding range of a species, or breeding territory of a species, right? So it's not just like the exact location where the nest is, but it's also, you know, what area are they using to feed in or to brood their young in during the breeding season. That's also really important in terms of conservation for that species. So we want to be able to conserve the entire breeding area. Let's see, I've got a couple questions in here. So Andrea, did you want to ask a question? Is she still in here? Yeah, there she is.
Yeah. So I'm going to give you a sequence of observations and you tell me how I should code it.
Okay.
So outside the back door at my banding station, it's a lot of dogwood and honeysuckle and things. And I started hearing a lot of little peeping noises, and I would go try to find whatever nest it was, and I would flush a female cardinal. And this would happen over and over again. I was never able to find the nest. I was never able to see young. I was never able to see a cardinal feeding anything or bringing food to anything. It was just little peepings that would happen maybe 20 or 30 minutes apart. And if I went to look, a female cardinal would fly away.
So, and for some species, like, so for example, just yesterday, I heard a bunch of titmice begging, and I'm familiar enough with a young titmouse begging sound that I'm confident enough to call that a fledgling. So I would say for yours, if you know what the begging call of a young cardinal is, and you feel confident in identifying that, you could call it fledgling, or a nest with young, depending on what you're hearing. But aside from that, if you don't know that, you're not familiar with those sounds, then I think the highest code you could do is N for probable nest site.
Okay.
Yeah. So did you have more questions, or is that's the one? Okay. All right. So there are some other questions in the chat. So let me try to get to these. Ben asked, do you have any advice on coding for chimney swift sightings since you can't see the actual nest? Yes, I did a species profile for chimney swift last year. I think it was last year. And there are a few different behaviors. They are one of the really tricky species. That's why I did a species profile for them. You know, when they're doing the V flights, so that's when they're doing courtship. They kind of hold their wings up in this sharp V and they fly around. That's like a courtship type thing. It is possible to see them carrying nesting material. For that, it's probably easiest to actually take photos of them in flight and then look at the photo afterwards. You're probably not going to ever see them carrying food because it's going to be further back in their mouth. So yeah, so let me just pull up the species profiles, and yeah, somebody else asked for a link to all of them. Yeah, so actually there, if you go to that handbook and materials link that I put in there before, and scroll down, you'll see all of the species profiles. And here I'll put in the links. I'm sorry, I'll put in the chat the link to the chimney swift one in particular. So that is in there. So there are a lot more information in there about chimney swifts, but yeah, they're pretty hard to confirm for sure.
I have a tip about chimney swifts that I learned
Yeah.
from atlasing before. Before there were chimneys in North America, they did nest, and it's usually on bogs and the tops of rotten dead trees and bogs. So
Mhm.
you always want to look there, and you can also see them in those scenarios, like breaking off little twigs off dead conifers at that time of year, and they'll be carrying them, and then you'll see them obviously feeding young, like going down the top of those dead trees where they're hollowed out. But that's a good tip if you're around a beaver dam area or something like that. Always look for the chimney swifts nesting there.
Yeah, that's what I always think whenever I see a chimney swift in the Adirondacks. I start looking for those hollowed out trees. But I've actually only ever seen a chimney swift colony in a hollowed out tree in like Arkansas, but not actually in New York. So somebody asked if a bird is carrying food for a mate, how do you code it? Exactly. You don't know whether they're carrying it for their mate or for their young. So carrying food would be used for any time it's carrying food. Exactly. Because you don't know. And really, like, even if like say you see a male bobolink carrying food somewhere, it could be feeding the female that's sitting on the nest, and there could even be young in the nest. But how would you ever know? You wouldn't have a clue. So just use it for anytime you see it carrying food.
Kind of speaking of that, I have kind of a question. It's not
Mhm.
necessarily so like say the other day I watched a chickadee carry a caterpillar to a cavity and another chickadee do the same thing at the same time. It's like, okay, obviously they're carrying food and that's what I had them coded as, I think. But then so one went in all the way into the cavity, presumably feeding babies, and then came out, empty, beaked. And then the other one went in and then did the same thing. So it's like, okay, they were carrying food, so they're confirmed. But should I call that nest with young? Because obviously they have a nest with babies. It's just I can't see them.
Yep. Yeah, I would nest with young.
Okay. I'm pretty sure that is what I coded. I have to look. But okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
This has been awesome, by the way. I feel like I learned a lot, especially your tips in the beginning were really fantastic. So
Great. Thank you. Let's see. It looks like I've answered all the other questions in the chat at the moment. Let me know if I missed something in here. Just please either repaste it or unmute yourself and feel free to ask a question. Are there other questions at the moment?
Could you talk about birds doing distraction displays and what species are appropriate for that, or what should you do? Because the handbook seems to rule out lots of species. Not the handbook, the acceptable reading codes chart seems to rule out a lot of species. So I'd be curious to know what the thinking is.
Yeah, so the acceptable breeding codes chart, I do need to make a few adjustments to that. There's a number of warblers that I have since learned that actually do distraction display that are not marked in there. And there's very well could be other species as well that I'm not aware of. So definitely send me edits if you've seen something that you're pretty sure is distraction display, and I'll look it up. And so distraction displays, a lot of other atlases define that as when the bird puts itself in danger. And by that, usually it's pretending that its wing is broken or its leg is broken, or it's like not really getting out of the way, and it's letting you get close to it. And then once you get close, it kind of like scurries away a little bit, and it wants you to follow it and like keep, direct you off away from its young or nest. So a lot of other atlases define it that way, but it's sometimes vague for some people. So usually it's some sort of a broken wing display, or it comes in and like ruffed grouse will just like kind of like charge at you and like kind of screech, and I don't even know how to describe it. It's like a injured dog or something. It's like this really weird things that they do. So yeah, so it can be anything like that. And there are, like I said, there's a number of other warblers that do that as well that aren't on that sheet, but I think most of the other species are okay. Was there something in particular that you were thinking of, Charlie?
Well, for example, I've seen junco.
Yep. Oh, you're
We
breaking
call
up.
agitated. Oh,
Okay.
so those something like that. They come flying.
You're breaking in and out. I can't quite hear you. Sorry. Is it just me, or do other people hear him?
Yeah, it's breaking up. Yeah.
I can't hear him.
Okay. So but juncos, you said.
I've run into ovenbirds doing that, a distraction display.
Ovenbirds do it. I'm trying to think if I've ever seen a junco doing a full distraction display. I mean, they get really mad for sure. And they will basically, like call and like scoot around and like flash their tail at you and like and call at you, but they're not really like pretending that they're injured or kind of putting themselves at risk. They're really just trying to like chase you away. In my experience,
There's
yeah.
also the agitated behavior code.
Yeah, exactly. So that's where I think I would always put junco under agitated, but I mean, I could be wrong. It could just be my limited experience. But yeah, I think junco would be something I would say doesn't have a distraction display. Ovenbird does. Common yellow throats do. They can be really easy to confirm sometimes, yellow throats, because you pish once and they come in and they are like flopping around like they're gonna die.
A kind of rare breeder that does a broken wing thing is a palm warbler. So
Okay.
if you're in an area where there might be palm warblers, they'll do the broken wing thing and the quivering, and they'll die several times for you if you don't move along. So yeah, good one to watch.
I had a veery like fly straight at me and scream. I mean, I didn't even know veeries could make this sound. It like really loud, screamed and like flew right at me. Like I thought it was gonna hit me. I have it as agitated, obviously, but I could that be a distraction display?
Hmm. I would think it more as agitated.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's what I thought. Yeah, I'm sure I'll be able to confirm them if I manage to get back to that spot before they're done. But because there were like over a dozen of them, there were a lot of them.
Mhm.
Thanks.
Julie, I've had an experience recently twice in like a week where I had two American bitterns together in the marsh and I could physically see them. And what I assumed was the smaller female was making like what I would call the flight, the kind of awk call and moving around the marsh. And he was pursuing her. And I kind of coded it as courtship. It reminded me a little bit though of like a hen mallard who is broody and then the drake wants to breed and she's like nothing to do with him. Have you ever heard of such a thing or have you any idea what was going on?
I don't know, honestly. Um, yeah, with my limited experience with bitterns, I would say either it's courtship or like a territorial display where it's trying to get the other one out, but I don't really know. Does anyone else have experience with them? Or I mean, I'll definitely look it up, Stacy, and get back to you too. But does anyone else have any experience? No? Okay. Okay. Let me just see. There's a couple more questions, and then I just want to make one announcement too before we finish up. So Ken asked if you hear a crow begging but can't see it, what would the appropriate code be? I would do fledgling if you're really sure that it's a crow. I would do fledgling. And then Andrea asked about physiological evidence. Oh yeah, I know. I saw this on eBird. I don't know. So different atlas projects consider the physiological evidence code to be either probable or confirmed. And it just depends on the atlas project. We do consider it to be confirmed instead of probable. But eBird has it as probable. It's just how they've coded it, but it still will count as confirmed for us in New York. Yeah. So the one announcement I wanted to make, and I'll be sending out an email actually tomorrow announcing this too, but we are doing the Big Atlas weekend again this year. And this year we have actually 6 Atlas projects that are participating. So we have the same 4 as last year: Maine, New York, North Carolina, Maryland, and DC. And then we have Ontario and Newfoundland are also joining us this year. So there's six of us organizing, and that's going to start. The kickoff starts next Wednesday. We have Robin Bailey talking. She is the project coordinator for Project Nest Watch out of Cornell Lab. That should be really fascinating. You know, she'll have like a different perspective on breeding birds and tracking breeding. In that case, you actually are watching a nest and tracking that nest over time. And then next weekend will be the competition throughout the weekend. And then the following Wednesday, we'll have the award ceremony again. So very similar to last year. But I just wanted to mention that before people log off. So All right, it is 8 o'clock. If anyone has any last minute burning questions, please feel free to hang on and I'll answer your questions. Otherwise, hope you have a good evening and have fun getting out there and Alicing and getting more confirmations. It's good to see everyone.
Thanks, Julie. Good night.
Good night. Bye.
Bye. Thanks, Julie.